Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing a massive deep dive, a 1.5 million year journey to figure out exactly how human education evolved. How did we go from literally surviving in the wild to sitting in those bell-driven, scheduled modern classrooms? Like, when did that first human actually decide, hey, what I know is absolutely crucial to pass on? Well, that's exactly what we're unpacking today.
To really get a grip on this, let's contrast the incredibly familiar classroom setup with the raw, life-or-death reality of our ancient ancestors. Think about it. Right now, there's a kid sitting in a room, staring at a whiteboard, just waiting for a bell to ring. But back in the day, a hunter-gatherer child was intensely watching an elder's hands. They were copying movements, failing, trying again, and getting corrected, often without a single word even being spoken.
And here is the kicker. For literally 99% of human history, the classrooms, the bells, the teachers we just totally take for granted today, they did not exist at all. But somehow, against all odds, every single generation managed to pass down the whole shebang. Languages, complex skills, exactly which plants would kill you, how to track prey across miles of open terrain, basically how to not die.
So, let's look at this first era. Before the classroom existed, learning was purely a matter of survival.
The way we transferred knowledge completely transformed over the eons. Go way back, like 1.5 million years ago. The Aetulian hand axe. These things had a design so incredibly precise and consistent, the only way to replicate it was through direct, silent demonstration. You watched, you made it, you passed the skill on. Jump forward to about 300,000 years ago, and early Homo sapiens are living in small bands where the elders were essentially living libraries. If you needed to know which roots were safe during a massive drought, you asked the person who actually survived the last one. Then, by 100,000 years ago, we're seeing really complex artifacts in Blombo's cave. And then by 36,000 years ago, those absolutely breathtaking, anatomically perfect animal paintings in Chauvet Cave. All this sophisticated knowledge lived in the community long before it lived in any one individual. Now this is fascinating. When anthropologists recorded the Juansi people of southern Africa, literally one of the oldest continuous cultures on the planet, they found something wild. A whopping 81% of their nighttime campfire conversation was storytelling. We're talking myths, tales of ancestors, and moral lessons completely wrapped up in narrative. So the original curriculum, it wasn't a textbook, it wasn't a room, it was a fire and a voice in the dark carrying vital information forward through time.
But why do we actually need so much time to absorb all these stories and skills? Well, evolutionary biologists love to point this out. Chimpanzees become pretty self-sufficient just a few years after weaning. Humans, we take roughly 18 years. And that incredibly long childhood isn't some evolutionary bug, it's a feature. It's a dedicated 18-year window designed specifically for us to learn, to accumulate knowledge across generations, and to build something no other species has ever managed: compounding culture.
You can actually see this compounding culture in the Blombo's cave discoveries in South Africa. Archaeologists found processed ochre pigment and these little perforated shell beads. Creating them required multiple, highly deliberate steps. You had to grind the pigment, mix it with other materials, carefully store it in abalone shells, and then pierce those shells without shattering them. These weren't just happy accidents. This was an intentional process that absolutely had to be learned, rigorously practiced, and memorized across generations.
For hundreds of thousands of years, that system worked flawlessly. But then, roughly 10,000 years ago, agriculture came along and flipped the script. Humans stopped wandering and started farming. Populations skyrocketed, and society got complicated fast. Farmers suddenly needed to track seasons, traders had to do math, rulers needed to write down laws. Which brings us to a massive, pivotal question. What actually happens when the sheer volume of information outgrows what human memory can carry? Well, we enter a new era. When knowledge outgrew memory, we saw the invention of writing and bureaucracy.
To fix that memory bottleneck, humans invented writing. And honestly, this was a game changer. It permanently altered education because for the first time ever, knowledge was moved outside the human body. It could be stored, copied, and outlive its creator. By around 2500 BCE, the Sumerians built the first formal schools on record, the Edupa, or House of Tablets. Archaeologists have actually dug up tens of thousands of clay tablets that are basically the homework of kids from 4,500 years ago. These students enrolled before they were 10, and they spent about 12 years doing grueling practice. Just copying cuneiform script over and over, doing math, astronomy, learning agricultural science, and legal principles, all to become highly specialized scribes for the state.
And you can see how huge of a shift this is. Education used to be this deeply personal tool for surviving the natural world, but suddenly, it morphs into this highly specialized machinery needed to run the very first cities. These early schools were absolutely not built for curiosity. They were built for bureaucracy. Education literally became a tool of the state.
But then, things shift again. Education for the mind, the Greek Revolution.
It really kicks off with Socrates. The guy wrote literally nothing down, and his classroom was just wherever two people in Athens were willing to argue with him. He used what we now call the Socratic method. It's this relentless, systematic questioning that forces you to examine what you actually know versus what you just assume you know. It was a wildly disruptive way to teach. In fact, it was so disruptive they executed him for it in 399 BCE, basically for asking way too many uncomfortable questions.
Deeply shaken by that execution, his student Plato goes off and founds the Academy in Athens. This wasn't about training bureaucrats. It was a place to study philosophy, math, and ethics simply because they were essential for understanding reality itself. Tradition says Plato even hung a sign right above the entrance that read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." It was at this very academy that a 17-year-old Aristotle showed up, ended up staying for 20 years, and then went on to systematize the academic disciplines we literally still use today.
Next up, we see the rise of standardization, bringing mass literacy and state compulsion.
Jumping ahead a bit, in 1088, the University of Bologna opens up as the first continuously operating university. Then, boom, 1440, the printing press arrives and changes the entire landscape. Books are suddenly cheap enough for everyday people, not just kings or monks. Ideas are spreading like wildfire, way faster than any single teacher could travel. Mass literacy becomes an absolute necessity. And this, inevitably, leads states to step back in and take control. In 1763, Prussia rolls out compulsory state education, and England follows in 1870. For the first time in human history, sitting in a public school wasn't just an option, it was legally required by the state for every single child.
Which brings us to our final takeaway. The fire moved indoors. A relationship turned into an institution.
If you think about it, these four eras are completely different educational universes. First, hunter-gatherers, where the core goal was purely survival. Then the Sumerian Empire, focused entirely on administration. Ancient Greece pivots the goal toward deep understanding. And finally, 18th century Prussia introduces compliance and standardization. And here's the crazy part. Every single modern school system today is basically a giant, complex mashup of all four of these totally distinct goals just stacked on top of each other over centuries.
So the absolute biggest takeaway from this entire explainer is summed up perfectly in this quote. The institution came later, the relationship came first. For the vast majority of our time on this planet, education wasn't a building you were forced to go to. It was an urgent, intimate relationship between someone who knew something and someone who desperately needed to know it to survive. That existed long before we built massive classrooms to scale and standardize learning. Yes, we built these institutions to educate billions, but in the process, we fundamentally changed the nature of the experience itself.
Look, the modern system undeniably works. We are educating billions of people, and that's incredible. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative question. What is gained and what is tragically lost when the organic life-or-death urgency of the prehistoric campfire is transformed into a mandated, scheduled 45-minute block of time? The fire of human knowledge is still burning, for sure, but how we choose to gather around it, well, that changes absolutely everything. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.